That's always something I always forget to do is record. All right. So with this, paper one skills. Remember with paper one skills, and we're going to do this together. All right. So by the end of the hour, we should have most of it done. Paper one skills. The first two questions are all comprehension type, and there might be a political cartoon or an extract. Then the next question is going to be your good old origin, purpose, content, value limits, so the OPCVL. Then the next question is going to be your compare and contrast. All right, and there's going to be some similarities and differences. And then the last one, and we'll spend some time with that, is kind of the big one, what we call the mini essay. And I'll explain to you really how big an introduction is and how big a conclusion is. All right, so without further ado, let's take a look at this. Okay, so political cartoon here with the first one. All right, so let's play around with this. So you got a political cartoon. It's a Dutch political cartoon from 1999, and the question is, why might the political cartoon source A be seen as ironic? Explain your reasoning. So that's what you always want to do, is you want to look at the source, take a look at it, read it, kind of look at where it's coming from or its origin. Maybe do a quick look of what the action going on in there, and as well as the question. So looking at this, how can this be seen as ironic? Seen as ironic. Tyson, what do you got here?
It could be seen as ironic because of the context is the NATO bombings of the Serbian forces, and like the kind of dialogue that's teaching those Serbs that violence doesn't pay, and they're kind of teaching them that lessons through the violence of bombing.
Okay. All right. So how can we make these into sentences or statements that will help us answer this question? Remember, we always want to make sure that we are referencing the source here. And so NATO says that the Serbs are being violent, but NATO is using violent means to teach them a lesson. So NATO is using violent means to teach Serbs a lesson. Did I reference the source in here in any way? So if I forget to, I can do this at the end. I can do that at the end. So now that's how we know that it's coming out of source A. That was a nice little tip that was mentioned at one of the IP roundtables by a paper one reader, was you can still reference it by just simply doing that. And that's kind of like an in-text citation, like that type. All right, so NATO is using violent means to teach the Serbs a lesson. And then why is NATO getting involved in the first place? Possibly here. Or as an extension of this, I mean, really, what's the bombing creating? It's creating destruction. It's creating violence. Because we know that from our understanding of Kosovo, the bombing by NATO created destruction and violence. Which is implied with source A. So again, it's implied. And so that's what happens with political cartoons is there's some inferring that you can do, or you can imply some things as well. But this type one, usually with a political cartoon, we're looking for two statements. You could get 3 statements in here as well. Speaking about the serve action. All right, we kind of understand. Get that one? Okay, this one's a fairly straightforward one. I'm gonna have to erase this, so hopefully you wrote this down, or you've got your own. Okay, the second one here is looking at a report by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the British Parliament assessed the impact of the NATO campaign. And source B, according to source B, how did NATO bombing change the nature of conflict? So that's the key here, is we want to see change the nature of the conflict. That's what we want to look at. We want to look for that change, all right? And so this is a government person sitting for a committee giving testimony. It is likely that the bombing did cause a change in the character of the assault upon the Kosovo Albanians. So it does say it did cause a change in the character of the assault. What had been an anti-insurgency campaign, albeit a brutal and counterproductive one, involving atrocities such as that at Racek in January of 1999, became a mass organized campaign to kill Albanians or to drive them out. It was partly because the Serbs' reaction to the bombing. So what is prompting it is the Serbs' reaction to the bombing, and partly because the launch of a campaign required that the OSC monitors be withdrawn, thereby removing one of the obstacles to take action against the Kosovo Albanian, Kosovo Albanians. All right, and the OSC is the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe. All right, I had actually mentioned them last week because they observed our presidential election. All right, so there's a lot of golden nuggets in here that can help us answer this question. What could one statement be here that help us answer this question?
Conflict became a mass organized campaign.
Okay, so going to according source B, the nature of conflict changed from what we got here, anti-insurgency campaign. Those are fancy words. To a mass organized campaign. All right. So mass organized campaign. And so what we got, it's interesting when they use the word insurgency. I think, you know, that's such a 20th or 21st century word. And so I thought it was ironic when they referred to the American colonists as an insurgency group and the British troops engaged in an anti-insurgency activity. Seems out of sorts here. All right, so that's huge. All right, what could be another statement then? And this is where we look at what is prompting the change. So what prompts the Serbs to do this?
NATO bombing.
Yes. In source B, Serbs increase or Serbs change because NATO NATO started bombing. Do a better job. You know, that can work here, skirted bombing, or the Serbs were reacting because NATO bombing. So however you want to use the but so now we got two statements. You know, we can actually even make a third one here. Finally or thirdly, Serbs could do this because monitors were removed. And monitors being, and if we wanted to, we could be very specifically, because I forgot to use the source itself, I'm gonna once again reference it there. And it should be B. Holy cow. Come on. Come on. I'm usually better on Tuesday. Usually better on Tuesday. What do we got?
So for the paper one, is it for like question one, we need 2 points, and then question two, we need 3 points?
So I think it all depends here. This one I threw in 3 statements. And you always want to try to get 2 to 3 statements as best as you can. All right. Even if it is for like the second part of one, still try to get 2 to 3 statements. All right. The examiner, in this case me, I'll know that sometimes the sources, they're just, some of them are lens itself where you can just spew out a lot of statements, and sometimes the sources, man, you just got to really bring it to find the 2 to 3 statements. It's like, we can find it in there. We can find it in there. All right. So we got 3 statements. We could have probably put 3 statements in that first one as well. All right. Got excited here? Understand this one? All right. So I think we can get comprehension. All right. And that's why I look at comprehension as kind of like money points here. This is where we really build it up. All right. And I do encourage you to please look at that rubric I put in there, so kind of know how you're being scored here. All right, so source C. Source C, or in this question, is going to look at the OPCVL. All right, so we're going to look at the OPCVL here. And we want to look at, again here, studying the nature of the war. So we want to study nature of the war here in 1999. All right, and so we got Serbian ambassador to the United Nations makes a statement about NATO bombing campaign, June 10th, 2000. All right, so about a year after the throwdown. He titles it Aggression, a Crime Against Humanity. All right, and this again is given by a Serbian ambassador. So it's a statement by Jovanovic, ambassador, permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to the United Nations, New York, June 10th, 2000. All right, Vladislav. All right. So those who decided to bomb the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia last year, who ordered and commanded the air raids, committed a crime against peace, a crime of aggression. The founding fathers of the United Nations emphasized that peace is one of the fundamental purposes and the highest value of the World Organization. By Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, the member states undertook to refrain in their international relations from threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state. International humanitarian law, exemplified by the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocol of 1997, provides for the protection of civilian populations. Acts aimed at spreading terror among civilian populations are banned. And it was precisely these banned acts that NATO resorted. Those who decided on military actions elected to proceed to terror bombing. Certain targets were hit many times within short intervals. A typical example was repeated bombings of a bridge in Varni on a busy market day about noon. At a time when it's fair to assume that many civilians were going to cross the bridge. All right, so we have to look at the origin, purpose, contents, analyze the value limits of source C for setting the nature of the war. All right, so with that being said, what's the origin of this source? What's the origin? What is going to be the origin here of this source? Where is it coming from?
I'm going to just be the top line under source C, the Serbian ambassador.
Absolutely. Let's keep it simple here. All right. So if I go my O, or better job here, the origin of source C is the Serbian ambassador. I'll work on my spelling. Really good. All right, way off. Oh, God. To the UN, to the United Nations. So the origin of source C is the Serbian ambassador to the United Nations. And here's where the purpose of the speech or I could have created a whole new statement. And the purpose of the speech was what? Of the statement / speech was to do what?
Make a statement about the NATO bombing campaign.
Okay. Was to give an observation or explanation of NATO bombing. The source gives us what about the bombing? What does the source give us about the bombing? So if we look at in the statement that he's given towards the UN, what can we say about what's he doing about the bombing?
Saying it violates.
Okay, violates UN laws. What else? Does he give us some examples? Okay, so the source gives us reasons why NATO was the aggressor and gives specific examples. Is that the content? Would you say that statement fulfills the content? I'd say yes, it does. I'd say yes, it does. Source gives us reasons why NATO was the aggressor and gives specific examples. Right? And so I could say the source content gives us da-da-da. So now, if we look at the value here, what makes this valuable? All right, so now we're looking at the value. Can we make a statement about any of those that is valuable?
Gives us perspective of Serbian how they felt about the bombing campaign.
Okay, so when we look at the value here, so what we want to do is what you said, you could break that up in a couple statements. So one of them is the value of the origin is it comes from a high ranking Serbian official, which is an ambassador. Okay, that gives it a little teeth because it's not coming from some schmo in the government. It's a high-ranking official. All right, agree or disagree with the ambassadors and all that stuff. There are high-ranking officials. Now, the value of the purpose is that it gives us Serbian perspective on the bombing by NATO. So we get their perspective, and we get that it comes from a high-ranking government official. And if you wanted to continue that, as well as specific details to the type of bombing. So again, those are money statements because it just covered the origin, purpose, and the content. Boom, got it all. So that's how. So this is why you need to do this part first. You need to do that part first so you can do that. All right. So hopefully you got that stuff down. All right. I'm going to erase this part up here. I'm going to put sorry, I got to erase it. Hopefully you got this. I am recording it, so you can always go back and you can look at it too. All right. Limits. All right, this is a big one here. Limits. Okay. All those values now can be flipped into limits. Does that make sense? Absolutely. All right. So a limit to source C is that it comes from an official in the Serbian government this is where we're throwing it. However what? What's that? Okay, now we can that could be a different one. That could be a different limit, but that's a good point that you brought up. This is where, do you think he represents everyone in the Serbian government? No. However, it may not be the view by other officials, right? Because you might have some moderates. You might have some moderates in the Serbian government who might have been trying to tell Slobodan Milosevic, you know what, this isn't worth it. It's not the right fight. Let's stop it. Let's sue for peace here, or let's prevent this. Let's give it to NATO here. we got a lot more to lose. All right, so it may not be. So now your point is a good one. All right, another limit to source C is that it only mentions NATO bombing. However, it does not mention Serbian actions. Right? Doesn't mention anything about Serbian actions. Yeah. NATO's bombing bridges and bombing markets and stuff like that. Doesn't mention what the Serbs are doing in Kosovo at all here. And another thing is here. What does he title his speech?
Aggression.
So what's he trying to do?
Label the NATO actions as communist.
Okay.
Prove their difference.
All right. So source C may have a motive. He wants to show that NATO is the aggressor, not Serbia. Money. There we go. So anytime you get a government official statement coming from a government, there's most likely going to be a motive. So here it's almost like you get your defaults going. You know, that's a limit because hey, the guy's an official, but he may not represent everything. They're leaving something out. They're not giving the whole picture because they might have a motive to it as well. Those are some big words here. Big things. Any questions?
How many limits and values you shoot for?
I always like to say 2 to 3.
Okay.
I always like to say 2, 3 would be best. This one again, we could easily come up with 3 statements. All right, we could come up with 3 statements. So that's why it's always very important that you do this first. Do this first, because it can help you then find your 2 to 3 statements. Make sense? All right. All right, what do we got here? Me and my fingers. I want to print something. I don't want to print something. All right. What's your thoughts on compare and contrast? Just in general, doing compare and contrast. What are your thoughts? You see that in front of you. Compare and contrast. Is it a skill that is complicated? It's easy? What do we got? Okay. All right. Agree, disagree? What do you think, Joe? You agree? All right. Wow. See, this is where I'm like, oh man, this is hard stuff. This is hard stuff. But again, we speak to maybe how we were taught the skill differently, right? Possibly. All right, so what we have here is source D and E. Both of them are going to deal with NATO bombing campaign. All right, they're both are going to deal with the campaign. So there's going to be some similarities and differences related to it. And we want to look at what does it reveal about it. They come out in 2006 and 2009, so about almost a decade after the throwdown in Kosovo. Both of them are done by, looks like scholars of some sort. All right. And I mentioned that just in case, you know, we have to stretch it to find the compare and contrast. But I think we could possibly find, again, 2 to 3 statements. All right, 2 to 3 statements if we can. We're going to create 2 paragraphs, one on the comparison and one on the contrast. All right, if we can. All right, so the first one here, and I'm just going to get my skim on and do it as quickly as possible here. But what you want to do as we're reading through here, maybe if you could underline things that show us about the nature of NATO actions here, about NATO bombing, okay? So the Allied political and military planners had hoped at the beginning of the war, Serbian leadership would agree to allow autonomy to the 2 million ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. However, the bombing campaigns offered the Serbs an excuse to scale up the killings and expulsion. In Washington, the focus was primarily on avoiding NATO casualties, but General Clark's attempt to shift this focus towards defeating the Serbs, and by doing so, end the Serb ethnic cleansing operation. To this end, Clark tried an attempt to increase the intensity of the NATO operation, planned a ground invasion, and to send in Apache helicopters that could operate closer to the ground and serve part of the military. However, Washington disagreed and refused Clark's proposal. Subsequently, NATO was rendered impotent to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, even though its original justification for intervention was exactly to stop the process. Former chairman of NATO's military committee, the German General Klaus Naumann, asserted that you can't stop human rights violation from a distance, and that you must be ready to commit ground troops, or the whole thing's a sham. President Clinton's refusal to deploy ground troops was a new U.S. policy of combatant immunity. General Clark later argued that the refusal to implement his intensification plans had fatally damaged NATO's effectiveness and ultimately have risked the lives of civilians. Okay, so that source reveals us that there was some difference of how this bombing operation should go. All right, that's key. All right, this one here, when negotiations at Rambouillet broke down, there followed an increase in attacks against the Albanian population. These attacks led to a vast flood of refugees, and in response, NATO decided to engage in military intervention against Serbia. NATO objective was to force an end, or at least to significantly disrupt the campaign of ethnic cleansing to take place in Kosovo. However, not only did the ensuing NATO airstrikes fail to prevent the humanitarian crisis continuing, they added a new source of death and destruction, which contributed to the largest movement of refugees since the Second World War. Oops. Ultimately, Slobodan Milosevic conceded to NATO demands June 9, 1989. The KFOR and the government of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, FRY, and the Republic of Serbia signed the military technical agreement in Macedonia. This agreement laid down the parameters for political resolution to the Kosovo crisis. It included immediate end to the violence and withdrawal of Serbian military, police, and paramilitary force. The agreement was officially accepted. All right. There has been criticism of the nature of the intervention from the beginning. Critics claim NATO was not pursuing international rules of warfare. NATO declared in public statements that all its bombings had acted in accordance with the Geneva Convention. However, on several missions, the bombing had incurred high civilian casualties. These seem to conflict with the official declaration of the alliance. It had been suggested that the choice of targets, the mean of attack, and the choice of particular weapons used by NATO were highly questionable. On almost 90 separate occasions, these questionable acts included the use of cluster bombs and depleted uranium in densely populated areas. Well, that just sounds like, wow, big stuff. All right, so with that said now, here we go. Compare and contrast. All right, and so we want to look at similarities here. All right. So what do we got? What could be one similarity? Go ahead.
Both source D and source E identify putting an end to the ethnic cleansing as a reason for the NATO bombing campaign.
Woo! There we go. Both sources D and E mention that putting an end to ethnic cleansing was the reason for the bombing. Trying to process what you said, but that is it. So now, another thing that you can do is give the specific examples. So, for the sake of time, I want you to find, or we need to put specific examples in each one. Okay, what's another general similar or compare statement here?
Both mentioned that there was criticism for the NATO bombing campaign.
Okay, so, all right, and the criticism though, so if you're going to say that in B or in D, what was the criticism?
I guess that could be more of a different about the actual criticism about, because in B, it was about like not having a ground invasion, and then source B, the criticism was about like all the civilian casualties and like where they were going on.
Okay, so I would use that more for the contrast. All right. So the reason to do was to stop the ethnic cleansing, right? Did it stop it? Do both sources say it didn't stop it? Yes, because in source E, it said it had caused like the largest movement of refugees since the Second World War. So that's huge. And it also mentions in source D, it says that NATO was rendered impotent to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, even though its original jurisdiction for was exactly to stop that process. So it does mention. So both sources, both source D and E mention that NATO bombings failed to stop ethnic cleansing. And then again, we want to have the specific examples, and I had mentioned those. Okay. Boom. Yes.
For the specific examples, would that be like one extra sentence?
Another sentence? Well, this is where you want to pull out a sentence for source D, what that specific example is, and then another one for that. Okay, if you can do that. But again, if we're rushing for time, in the actual exam, these are good overall statements that could get you some good points, but may just not get you all points. All right. We should have time. Typically, students have time at the end once we keep practicing those. All right. So here we go. Let's look at differences, and now we speak of the differences where So in source D, there was a difference over the type of campaign Kosovo among NATO leaders. All right, was that mentioned in source E? Did they mention anything about difference of opinions among NATO leaders? No. This was not addressed in source E. All right, in source E, there is mention of the type of questionable bombing, bombings. However, this was not mentioned in source D. Okay. You could expand on the type of campaign. You could get more specific if you wanted to, and you can expand more on the questionable bombings. All right, so one is looking at, in source D is looking at the operation, source E is looking at the results of NATO bombing. All of that is revealing about NATO bombing. Okay, questions with that? That's good, that's a good one. All right, plenty of time here. All right, plenty of time. All right, so hopefully you got that down. Now for the last one, and this is where you do want to, so again, when you take the exam, whether it's on Thursday or in May, it's all about setting a pace, And it's easy to get lost in these sources, but you got to have a sense of urgency here, you know. And so 5 minutes on question 1, 5 minutes on question 2, about 10 to 15 minutes on the OPV CL, 10 to 15 minutes on the compare and contrast, and you leave the rest of the time for this last one, right? Now I say it's a mini essay because you're going to write it like it's an intro, a body, and a conclusion. And the body paragraph is as much as you want to put in there. But when we talk about an intro and a conclusion, it's really about 2 statements. It's really about 2 statements. It's not one of these really long, drawn out introductions that you might have in a traditional essay because you just won't have the time. So you keep it simple. 2 statements at best. 1 to 2 statements here. Sources, you do want to make sure that you're using all the sources. All right? All right, and so in this case, it says 4. And on Thursday, you'll have 4 sources. Today, I got greedy and we have 5, I think. But you're going to have 4 sources that help you address the question and support your claims. And then outside information. So again, that review sheet that I gave you would include some outside information that could help you answer either a question on Rwanda or Kosovo. All right, and I'll try to put together a kind of like a review guide when it comes to May as well of what they might focus on. But this will give you additional information, gives more context to the sources. that are not included in the sources. I have it as a separate spot, but you can easily throw that in with your sources as well. You know, you can have it integrated, and then the conclusion. All right, so the question here is we want to look at using the four best sources, your own knowledge, what were the consequences of the NATO bombing offensive against Serbia and Fry? So we want to look for consequences. We want to look for consequences here. All right. And so if we think of a big statement here, big statement. All right. What can we say? Well, let's brainstorm here quickly. What can we say about consequences?
The ethnic cleansing was increased.
Okay, ethnic cleansing increased. All right, we got that. What else?
The Serbians were encouraged to carry out their ethnic cleansing operation due to the war.
Okay, so we can speak about Serbian actions. Okay, what else? What does bombing create?
Destruction, pillage, casualties.
All right, so we can speak of that. We can definitely speak of that. All right. What else could we? Is there anything else?
I mean, eventually it led to the end.
Okay. All right. So here we go. Here's how you can do this. All right. The bombing campaign would eventually lead to the end of Kosovo War. The bombing campaign caused the Serbs to be more aggressive, accelerated ethnic cleansing, okay, and cause significant damage. Okay, there you go. There's my intro. The bombing campaign would eventually lead to the end of the Kosovo War. The bombing campaign caused the Serbs to become more aggressive or be more aggressive, accelerated ethnic cleansing, and cause significant damage. So now I need to go back and find my sources that would match up with all that. Okay, so to do that, all right, do we have this? Hopefully we have this down. So here, if I'm speaking about Serbian becoming more aggressive, which source shows Serbia becomes more aggressive?
Source B.
Source what?
Source B.
Source B, yes. All right. So the Serbian forces became more aggressive by the bombings. In source B, the Serbs accelerated, or the Serbs were aggressive because monitors have left and they reacted to the bombings. Okay. So where does it show that they accelerated ethnic cleansing? Does source B also show that? Ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, it mentioned even a mass organized campaign to kill Kosovo Albanians.
Okay, can we also find another one that shows they did that?
I think source.
Yes, source E, all right. Okay, the bombings accelerated ethnic cleansing. This can be found in source B. It states that the Serbs moved. I'm going to call it. We want to specifically pull out some words here. It states that the Serbs campaign was to kill or expel or drive Albanians out. Furthermore, source.
We might actually use source B that has the statement we're looking for. It says, however, the bombing campaign offered the Serbs an excuse to scale up the kills.
Okay, well, source D is a good one too. And you might want to use source D and E as opposed to B, because you've already used B. All right. So remember, we want to make sure that we're using all our sources. But I already got that down. But furthermore, in source D, the bombings offered Serbs the excuse to scale up their activities. All right, you can use that. And then in source D, source E, you could go in addition in source E. But I may not want to use, or since I've already used it, but if you said you could go in addition in source E, the Serbs, or the bombings may have contributed to the largest mass refugees since the Second World War. Okay. What about speaking to the destruction of infrastructure? Or
That could be source C, ambassador of Serbia, where it talks about like the bridge being bombed
mhm.
and others, civilians to be on the bridge.
Yep. Yep. The bombing, so another one is, you know, the bombings cause damage to infrastructure. In source C, it mentions the bombings of bridges and markets. And in source E, it talks about the questionable damage or the questionable weapons being used that causes damage. All right, so that's how we can use all that stuff in there as well. So I'm running out of space here. So if I was going to add another statement in here, in source E, the bombings created damage in heavily populated areas. Okay, so boom, we got it all. That is all we got. We got different sources being used here. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4. We got them. Boom, it's covered. What could be some outside information that could be brought in here to add some more strength? With the bombing, some other outside information that could be brought in could be the bombing of the Chinese embassy. So does everyone have this part? Okay. Yeah. So other information that could be added in here that the bombings were not as precise. The bombings were not as precise because the Chinese embassy was destroyed. Okay, and so the UN or NATO was trying to say that, you know, they got sophisticated weapons that it hit certain targets. Well, here's an example of oops, it did not hit the right targets. And then other outside information that could be brought in here too could just simply be some more damage to non-military targets, but also some of the examples of massacres that can be brought in here as well, right? That can add strength to the idea of ethnic cleansing. Yes? Yep, go ahead. They'll get you a pass, make it legal. Okay. So in conclusion, wrap this thing up. So in conclusion, what can we say? Let's keep it simple.
What's the original claim? We just rewrite.
Absolutely, I would. So what do we say? What was our first statement? The bombings.
Would eventually lead to the end of the Kosovo War. The bombing campaign caused the Serbs to be more aggressive, accelerated
So how we go? In conclusion, oh, I don't know why that happened. That's crazy. In conclusion, NATO bombings, the NATO bombing campaign did lead to the end of the Kosovo War. However, the bombing campaign did contribute to Serbian aggressive actions, accelerated ethnic cleansing, and contribute to significant damage. Oh, period. Done.
So when we're talking about the sources, are we supposed to put in like direct quotes or just like mention that this information is mentioned in these sources?
Right. Either or works.
Probably depending upon time then.
Yep. Depending on time. Absolutely. Yep. Either or. Okay. My goal is always to get everyone to succeed on paper 1 exams, and we tend to do well. You know, historically, we're in the high 80s, low 90s. And if on the actual IB exam, if there's a spot where we get someone has a perfect, paper 1 is where we get a perfect. There are a few individuals that do get a perfect, which is huge. Overall, we haven't got one yet, but we got close. All right, there we have it. Questions on that? Now, we will revisit this idea of paper 1 skills when we look at some of the other topics. But we probably will not spend this much detail together going over how to answer these. It'll probably be more on you to practice. But at least the first 2, I want us to go through it, especially with Unit 1 since it specifically deals with paper 1 skills. Okay? All right, that's all I have for you this hour. We got a few minutes here. Remember, you just want to make sure you get the course of the Kosovan conflict and intervention taken care of. Share that with me. The impact questions of the Kosovo conflict, get that thing done as well. Okay? All right. There we go.